The thunder rolled across the South Dakota prairie as Yates Tucker pulled his hat lower against the driving rain, urging his horse toward the dim outline of his barn. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating his modest ranch on the outskirts of Lead, a property he'd purchased just 3 months prior with earnings from 5 hard years of cattle driving. It was 1878, and at 29, Yates had finally claimed a piece of the frontier for himself, though tonight, as water seeped through his duster and the temperature dropped, he questioned the wisdom of settling in such unforgiving country. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his spurs jangling as his boots hit the muddy ground. Leading his paint horse into the barn, Yates was struck immediately by the sense that something was amiss. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he secured the door behind him. The barn was darker than it should have been. The lantern he habitually left burning had been extinguished. "Who's there?" he called out, voice cutting through the sound of rain hammering on the roof. The only answer was his horse's snort and the scuffling of the other animals. He struck a match against his boot, the brief flare revealing nothing unusual before the flame died in the damp air. Moving cautiously toward the back of the barn, Yates found the lantern and lit it properly. As warm light spread through the space, he caught a flash of movement in his peripheral vision, a shifting shadow in the far corner, behind the hay bales. "I know you're there," he said evenly, raising the lantern higher. "Best come out now." When no one emerged, he approached slowly, holding the light before him. What he found sent a jolt through him. A woman, perhaps 22 or 23, huddled in the straw. Her dress was torn and mudded, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around a face marred by a spectacular bruise blooming across her right cheekbone. Her eyes, wide and terrified, fixed on him with the wariness of a cornered animal. "Please," she whispered, trembling visibly. "Don't hurt me." Yates immediately lowered the lantern and stepped back, giving her space. "Madam, I have no intention of hurting you." He kept his voice soft, the way he might speak to a spooked horse. "You're on my property, but you're welcome to shelter from the storm." Her eyes darted to the door, clearly calculating her chances of escape. "You're safe now," Yates whispered, removing his hat as a gesture of respect. "Whatever you're running from, it won't find you here tonight." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, though the tension never fully left her body. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Name's Yates Tucker," he offered, maintaining his distance. "This is my ranch." She hesitated before responding. Scarlett Sullivan. Miss Sullivan, you look like you could use some dry clothes and a hot meal." "My house isn't far, just across the yard. I can leave you here with the lantern if you prefer, bring supplies out to you, or you can come to the house where it's warm." Scarlett regarded him warily, clutching her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Yates admitted candidly. "But I reckon you've already made one hard choice tonight, coming here instead of staying wherever put those marks on you. I'm offering shelter, nothing more." A particularly violent crack of thunder made Scarlett jump. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "The house, then, but I'll be gone by morning." Yates didn't argue. He merely inclined his head in acknowledgement, then offered his duster. "It's wet, but it'll keep the worst of the rain off you for the short walk." She accepted the coat with trembling fingers, wincing as she stood. Yates pretended not to notice how she favored her left side, suggesting injuries beyond the visible bruising on her face. Whatever had happened to Scarlett Sullivan, it was clearly something from which she was desperate to escape. "Stay close," he instructed, raising the lantern to light their way. "The mud gets treacherous in weather like this." The journey from barn to house was brief but difficult. Scarlett stumbled twice on the uneven ground, and Yates had to resist the instinct to offer his arm for support. The woman was skittish enough without him making any uninvited contact. By the time they reached the porch of his modest two-room cabin, they were both soaked despite the protection of his duster. Inside, the house was simply furnished but neat. A fire burned low in the hearth, and Yates immediately set about building it up while Scarlett stood dripping on the plank floor, looking uncertain. "There's a screen in the corner," he said, nodding toward a folding wooden partition. "I'll find you some dry clothes. They'll be too big, but they'll serve until yours can be washed and dried." Scarlett nodded, her teeth chattering now. "Thank you, Mr. Tucker." "Yates," he corrected gently. "Mr. Tucker was my father." He turned his back to give her privacy, digging through his trunk for his smallest shirt and a pair of trousers with a drawstring waist that might stand some chance of staying up on her much smaller frame. He also located a clean towel, which he placed with the clothes on the chair beside the screen. "There's water heating on the stove," he called over his shoulder as he heard her move behind the screen. "I'll make coffee and some food while you change." As he busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and the last of his biscuits from morning, Yates tried to guess at Scarlett's story. A beaten wife. A woman fleeing some other kind of trouble. Lead was a mining town primarily, with all the rough edges that entailed. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had transformed the area in recent years, bringing with it opportunity, but also lawlessness and desperation. When Scarlett emerged from behind the screen, Yates barely recognized her. With her face washed clean of mud, her damp hair combed back and dressed in his clothes, she looked younger but somehow more formidable. The bruising on her face was even more pronounced against her clean skin, a violent purple stretching from her right eye down to her jaw, but she carried herself with a determined dignity. "The food smells good," she said, her voice stronger now. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." Yates gestured to the table. "Please sit. It's nothing fancy, but it's hot." They ate in relative silence, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Yates didn't press for information, and Scarlett volunteered none. It was only after they'd finished eating, when he poured them each a second cup of coffee, that she spoke unprompted. "My husband did this," she said quietly, touching her bruised cheek. "Not my husband anymore, I suppose. I left him." Yates nodded, keeping his expression neutral despite the anger that flared inside him. "That was brave of you." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Brave or foolish. I have no money, no family nearby, and now no shelter except what you've kindly provided for one night." "What brought you to my barn specifically?" Yates asked. Scarlett's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I've been walking for nearly 2 days. I saw the light from your barn from the road and thought. I don't know what I thought. That I might rest unnoticed until morning, perhaps." "And your husband? Will he be looking for you?" Her eyes darkened. "Roland is the foreman at the homestake mine. He has influence in Lead and friends among the lawmen. Yes, he'll be looking, and he won't be kind when he finds me." Yates considered this information carefully. The homestake was the largest operation in the area, employing hundreds of men. A foreman there would indeed have connections and power. "You said you'll be gone by morning," he said slowly. "Where will you go?" Scarlett's shoulders slumped slightly. "Deadwood, maybe. It's close enough to reach on foot and big enough that I might find work and disappear." "Deadwood's no place for a woman alone," Yates said before he could stop himself. The nearby town had sprung up virtually overnight with the gold rush, a lawless place of saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. "I have limited options, Mr. Tucker," she replied with a flash of defiance. "Yates," he corrected again. Then, after a moment's hesitation, You could stay here longer if you need to. I have the space and I could use help around the place." Scarlett looked up sharply. "In exchange for what?" The suspicion in her voice made Yates wince. "Just the help itself. I'm not proposing anything untoward, Miss Sullivan." "Mrs. Sullivan, technically," she murmured, "though I'd sooner go back to Miss Sullivan then," Yates agreed. "The offer stands. You need a safe place, and I need an extra pair of hands. My nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, and I've more work than one man can manage alone." Scarlett studied him carefully, as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning in his words. "Why would you help a stranger?" Yates looked into his coffee cup, considering his answer. "My mother left my father when I was 12, he said finally. "She took my sister and ran in the middle of the night. I stayed behind. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if someone had offered her shelter, a chance to truly get away." He looked up, meeting Scarlett's gaze. "I'd like to think someone would have done the same for her." Something in Scarlett's expression softened, though the wariness never completely left her eyes. "I'll stay until the end of the week," she said at last. "To repay you for your kindness tonight, then I'll decide what comes next." "Fair enough," Yates agreed, standing to clear their dishes. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't." "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "You're injured and exhausted. I sleep out under the stars half the year anyway. A pallet by the fire is luxury compared to some places I've rested my head." Too tired to argue further, Scarlett accepted with a nod. Minutes later, she was tucked under the quilt on his simple bed, while Yates arranged his bedroll near the hearth. As the storm continued to rage outside, an uneasy peace settled within the cabin. Neither fully trusted the arrangement, but both recognized it as the best available option for now. Yates lay awake long after Scarlett's breathing had evened into sleep, his mind turning over the unexpected developments of the evening. He'd come to South Dakota seeking solitude and a chance to build something of his own, far from the ghosts of his past in Texas. Now he found himself harboring a fugitive wife, potentially inviting trouble from one of the most powerful men in lead. Yet as he listened to the soft sound of Scarlett's breathing across the room, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. There was something about her, a determination beneath the fear, a strength, despite her circumstances, that resonated with him. Whatever came next, he knew he'd made the right choice in offering those words that had finally allowed her shoulders to relax, if only slightly. "You're safe now." Morning arrived with reluctant golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Yates woke at dawn, as was his habit, to find Scarlett already up and moving quietly around the small kitchen area. She had folded his blankets neatly and was now attempting to prepare breakfast, though her unfamiliarity with his setup was evident. "You needn't do that," he said, his voice rough with sleep. Scarlett startled slightly, then composed herself. "I want to earn my keep, however briefly I'm here." Yates rose and stretched, noting how Scarlett averted her eyes from his bare chest. He quickly pulled on a shirt. "Coffee first, then we can discuss arrangements." The morning routine established a careful rhythm between them. Yates showed Scarlett where he kept supplies, explained the temperamental nature of the stove, and outlined his usual daily tasks. For her part, Scarlett proved a quick study, despite her obvious discomfort with certain movements that aggravated her hidden injuries. "I need to go into town today," Yates said as they finished a breakfast of fried potatoes and salt pork. "I've been putting it off, but we need supplies if you're staying." Fear flashed across Scarlett's face. "He'll be looking for me." "I know. That's why you'll stay here out of sight. I'll do the necessary business as quickly as possible." "If Roland learns you're helping me, he won't," Yates assured her. As far as anyone in Lead knows, I'm just a quiet rancher who keeps to himself. I've barely spoken to 10 people since I moved here in April. Scarlett didn't look convinced, but she nodded. Be careful all the same. Roland has eyes everywhere, and a temper that doesn't discriminate between those who cross him directly and those who merely get in his way. I'll bear that in mind, Yates promised. After leaving Scarlett with instructions about caring for the animals and warnings about which parts of the property might be visible from the road, Yates saddled his horse and headed toward Lead. The town was bustling despite the early hour, miners changing shifts at the homestake and merchants opening their establishments for the day's business. Yates moved efficiently, purchasing only what was essential: flour, coffee, salt, sugar, ammunition for his rifle, and after a moment's hesitation, a bolt of sturdy cotton fabric and some basic sewing supplies. He tried to appear casual as he asked the shopkeeper's wife about local news, but his heart quickened when she mentioned the search for a missing woman. "Foreman Sullivan's wife," the woman said, leaning across the counter conspiratorially. "Ran off 2 nights ago, can you imagine? Such ingratitude after all he's done for her. Took her in when her father died, gave her a fine house, the best clothes." "Is that so?" Yates kept his tone neutral. "Oh yes, and now the poor man's beside himself, offering a reward and everything for information. Says she's not right in the head, prone to hysterics and delusions." The woman shook her head. "These delicate types aren't suited for life out here. Need a firm hand, they do." Yates bit back a retort, thanked the woman for the supplies, and left the store with his purchases secured in his saddlebags. He was about to mount his horse when a commotion further down the street caught his attention. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard was emerging from the marshal's office, flanked by 2 deputies. Even without Scarlett's description, Yates would have recognized authority in his bearing. This had to be Roland Sullivan. Keeping his head down, Yates busied himself with adjusting his saddle, watching surreptitiously as Sullivan addressed a small gathering of men. "I want every homestead within 20 miles checked," Sullivan was saying, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. "She can't have gotten far on foot, not in her condition. $100 to whoever brings her back to me, alive and unharmed." One of the men in the group called out, "What if she doesn't want to come back, Sullivan?" Sullivan's laugh was cold. "My wife is confused, gentlemen. She suffered a fall that addled her wits. It's my duty to see her properly cared for, whether she understands that or not." The explanation seemed to satisfy most of the crowd, though Yates noticed a few exchanged glances that suggested not everyone fully believed Sullivan's version of events. Before he could observe more, Sullivan's gaze swept the street and briefly locked with his. Yates touched the brim of his hat in a casual greeting before mounting his horse and riding away at an unhurried pace, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to gallop full speed back to the ranch. Only when Lead was well behind him did Yates urge his horse into a faster gait. Sullivan's words echoed in his mind. Not in her condition. What had he meant by that? Was Scarlett more seriously injured than she had let on? Or was there something else she hadn't shared? He found her in the barn when he returned, methodically mucking out stalls with a determination that belied her injuries. She straightened when she heard him approach, wincing slightly as she did so. "You shouldn't be doing that," Yates said, dismounting. "Those ribs need time to heal." Scarlett set the pitchfork aside. "How did you know about my ribs, the way you move? I've broken enough of my own to recognize the signs." He began unloading his purchases. "I saw your husband in town." Her face paled. "Did he see you?" "Briefly, but he has no reason to connect me to you." Yates recounted the scene in town, including the reward being offered. He said something about your condition that made me wonder if there's more you haven't told me. Scarlett's hand moved unconsciously to her midsection, and understanding dawned on Yates like a physical blow. "You're with child," he said quietly. She nodded, tears springing to her eyes. "Almost 4 months along. Roland, he found out and was furious. Said it would interfere with his plans for us to move to San Francisco next year. He'd been drinking and he—" She trailed off, unable to continue. "He tried to ensure there would be no child," Yates finished for her, a cold rage building in his chest. "Yes," Scarlett whispered, "but I protected myself as best I could. When he finally passed out, I ran. I couldn't stay, not after that. I won't let him harm my baby." Yates took a deep breath, struggling to contain his anger. "Then we need to be more careful than I thought. If Sullivan is willing to hurt his own unborn child, he won't hesitate to harm anyone who stands in his way." "I should leave," Scarlett said, wiping away her tears. "I've brought danger to your door." "No," Yates said firmly. "Leaving now would be the most dangerous option. Sullivan has men searching every homestead within 20 miles. Your best chance is to stay hidden here until the initial search dies down." Scarlett looked unconvinced. "And then what?" "I can't impose on you indefinitely." "We'll figure that out when the time comes," Yates promised. "For now, let's focus on keeping you and your child safe." He hesitated, then reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the fabric and sewing supplies. "I thought you might need these. Your dress is beyond repair, and you can't continue wearing my clothes if you need to go into town eventually." Surprise registered on Scarlett's face as she accepted the bundle. "You thought of this." "My mother was a seamstress," he explained, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I grew up watching her make something from nothing. Thought you might be able to do the same." A genuine smile transformed Scarlett's face despite the bruising. "I can. My father was a tailor before he died. He taught me everything he knew." The shared moment of connection was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the main road. Yates immediately tensed, peering out the barn door. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "At least 3, maybe more," Scarlett's breath caught. "Sullivan's search party." "Most likely. Quick, there's a storage cellar beneath the house. It's small, but it'll hide you." He took her arm, guiding her swiftly toward the cabin. "Take only what you need to stay quiet and comfortable. I'll handle them." Inside the house, Yates pulled back the rug in the corner and revealed a trapdoor. "My predecessor used this to store preserves and escape the summer heat. There's a small air vent that leads outside, disguised as a groundhog hole. Stay absolutely silent, no matter what you hear." Scarlett clutched the fabric to her chest, her face resolute despite her obvious fear. "Yates, thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he replied grimly. "Just stay safe." He helped her down the ladder into the cramped space, then closed the trapdoor and replaced the rug. By the time the riders reached his property, Yates was casually chopping wood outside the cabin, his rifle propped against the wall within easy reach. 4 men approached, Sullivan himself at the lead. Up close, Yates could see the man was expensively dressed, with cold gray eyes that assessed the ranch with obvious disdain. "Afternoon," Yates called, embedding the axe in the chopping block and wiping his hands on his trousers. "Something I can help you gentlemen with." Sullivan dismounted smoothly. "Roland Sullivan, foreman at the homestake." He extended a hand that Yates reluctantly shook. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced, though I noticed you in town earlier." "Yates Tucker," he responded. "Bought this place from old Jim Harrington this past spring." Sullivan nodded, glancing around the property with undisguised contempt. "Bit isolated out here, isn't it, Tucker?" "That's rather the point," Yates replied evenly. "I prefer my own company most days." "I'll get straight to business then. I'm looking for my wife. She wandered off a couple nights back, not well, I'm afraid, suffered a fall that's affected her thinking." Sullivan reached into his coat and produced a small photograph. "This is Scarlett. Have you seen her?" Yates studied the photograph with what he hoped was the right amount of interest. It showed a younger, happier Scarlett, her hair styled fashionably, wearing a high-necked dress that spoke of wealth beyond what most in Lead could afford. "Can't say that I have," Yates said, handing the photograph back, "but I'll keep an eye out. You said there's a reward." Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Indeed, $100 for her safe return." "That's generous," Yates remarked. "Must be worried about her." "She's carrying my child," Sullivan said, his voice suddenly hard. "A delicate condition made more precarious by her. Accident. She needs proper medical attention, which she won't find wandering the wilderness." One of Sullivan's companions, a man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest, spoke up. "Mind if we have a look around, Tucker, just to be thorough?" Yates shrugged with deliberate casualness. "Help yourselves. Not much to see, though." The men spread out, checking the barn and outbuildings while Sullivan accompanied Yates into the cabin. Yates was acutely aware of Scarlett hidden beneath their feet as Sullivan prowled around the small space, examining everything with a critical eye. "You live simply," Sullivan observed, the words clearly not intended as a compliment. "A man doesn't need much out here," Yates replied. "Just a roof, a bed, and work that satisfies." Sullivan paused by the table where Scarlett's sewing supplies lay. "You sew, Tucker?" Yates forced a laugh. "Poorly, but necessarily. Can't always get to town when things need mending." Sullivan picked up a spool of thread, rolling it between his fingers before setting it down. His gaze lingered on the neatly folded blankets by the fireplace. "You sleep there?" he asked, gesturing to the makeshift bed. "Sometimes," Yates answered truthfully. "Old habit from my trail days. Some nights a soft bed feels too strange." Sullivan seemed about to say more when one of his men appeared at the door. "Nothing in the barn or the storehouse, boss. No sign anyone's been here but Tucker." Relief washed through Yates, carefully hidden behind a neutral expression. "Well, that's that then," Sullivan said, heading for the door. He paused on the threshold, turning back to Yates. "If you do see my wife, Tucker, I'd appreciate immediate word. She's vulnerable in her condition." "Not thinking clearly." "Of course," Yates agreed. "I hope you find her soon." Sullivan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I will. Good day to you." Yates watched from the porch as the four men mounted up and rode away, waiting until they were well out of sight before rushing back inside and pulling back the rug. "Scarlett, they're gone." When he opened the trapdoor, he found her huddled in the corner of the small space, clutching her knees to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. "He's not going to stop," she whispered as Yates helped her up the ladder. "He'll never stop looking." Yates guided her to a chair, pouring her a cup of water with hands that weren't quite steady. "Then we'll need to be smarter than him." "How?" Scarlett asked, despair evident in her voice. "You heard him. He has money, influence, men at his disposal. I have nothing." "You have me," Yates said without thinking. The words hung in the air between them, unexpected and yet somehow inevitable. Scarlett looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Why? Why risk everything for someone you barely know?" It was a fair question, one Yates had been asking himself since the night before. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, "and because I know what it's like to feel trapped with no way out." Their eyes held for a long moment before Scarlett nodded slowly, accepting his answer without further question. "What do we do now?" Yates sat across from her, his mind racing through possibilities. "Sullivan will have men watching the roads and the stage lines. Even if you manage to get to Deadwood, he'd find you eventually. So I'm trapped here," Scarlett concluded. "For now, Yates agreed. "But not forever. We need to create a new identity for you, one Sullivan can't trace back to Scarlett Sullivan. How do we do that?" Yates considered the problem. "I have a friend in Rapid City, Samuel Hayes. He owns a print shop, dabbles in photography. He might be able to help with papers, a marriage certificate perhaps under a different name." "A false marriage?" Scarlett asked, brow furrowed. "Or a real one," Yates said quietly. "If you became Mrs. Tucker in truth, Sullivan would have no legal claim on you or your child. But that's not something I'm suggesting you consider right now," he added hastily, seeing the shock on her face. Scarlett set down her cup with a shaky hand. "You would marry a stranger, take on another man's child, not a stranger," Yates corrected. "Someone I've chosen to help, whose welfare matters to me." He ran a hand through his hair, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not proposing, Scarlett. I'm offering options, one of which happens to be marriage." A strange silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Scarlett spoke. "Let me think on it," she said softly. "It's not a decision to make lightly." "Of course," Yates agreed, relieved she hadn't outright rejected the idea. "In the meantime, we focus on keeping you hidden and getting word to Samuel. If Sullivan's men return, we'll be ready." The days that followed established a cautious routine. Scarlett remained inside or close to the buildings, working on converting the fabric into serviceable dresses that would accommodate her growing condition. Yates taught her to shoot his spare revolver, insisting she be able to defend herself if necessary. They shared meals and conversation, gradually revealing pieces of their pasts to each other. Yates learned that Scarlett was the daughter of an English immigrant who had settled in Virginia, that she'd been married to Sullivan for just over a year after her father's death left her with mounting debts, and that she had once dreamed of opening her own dress shop. In turn, he told her about his nomadic life as a cattle driver, his complicated relationship with his absent father, and how he'd saved for years to buy the ranch. "Why South Dakota?" Scarlett asked one evening as they sat by the fire, she sewing while he cleaned his rifle. "Why not stay in Texas where you knew the land?" Yates was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. "I needed a fresh start," he said finally. "There was a woman, Catherine. We were to be married, but she chose another, a banker's son with better prospects than a cowhand." "I'm sorry," Scarlett said genuinely. Yates shrugged, though the memory still carried a sting. "It was for the best. She wanted things I couldn't provide: a fine house in town, social standing. I've always been more comfortable under the open sky than in drawing rooms. And now—" "What do you want from this place?" "Peace," he answered simply. "A chance to build something that's mine on my own terms, to wake up each day with purpose." Scarlett's hand stilled on her sewing. "That sounds wonderful, freedom to choose your own path." "It's what I want for you too," Yates said, meeting her gaze across the room. "Whatever you decide." A week passed with no sign of Sullivan or his men, though Yates remained vigilant whenever he rode to the property boundaries to check his small herd of cattle. He sent a carefully worded letter to Samuel in Rapid City, using language vague enough to avoid suspicion, but clear enough that his friend would understand help was needed. On the 9th day after Scarlett's arrival, as Yates returned from tending the livestock, he found her standing outside the cabin, one hand resting on her slightly rounded stomach, the other shielding her eyes as she looked toward the distant mountains. She had fashioned one of the dresses from the fabric he'd purchased, a simple design with room to expand as her pregnancy progressed. With her hair braided down her back and the bruises on her face fading to yellow, she looked like she belonged there, framed by the wild beauty of the South Dakota landscape. Something shifted in Yates's chest at the sight, a recognition of possibilities he hadn't allowed himself to consider fully. In the short time they'd known each other, Scarlett had shown herself to be resilient, clever, and kind. They worked well together, their strengths complementing each other's weaknesses. And though neither had spoken of it directly, Yates couldn't deny the growing attraction between them, a connection forged in crisis, but evolving into something deeper. "You look like you belong here," he said as he approached, the words escaping before he could consider them. Scarlett turned, a small smile playing at her lips. "Do I?" "Yes," he said simply, "very much so." Her smile faltered slightly. "I've been thinking about your suggestion about marriage." Yates's heart quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "And it's a practical solution," Scarlett said carefully. "It would give my child a name, me protection under the law, and you. What would it give you, Yates?" The question caught him off guard. What indeed would he gain from such an arrangement? Responsibility for a woman he barely knew and a child that wasn't his. Potential danger from a man like Sullivan, who clearly didn't relinquish what he considered his property easily. Yet as he looked at Scarlett standing in the golden afternoon light, Yates knew the answer was simpler than all that. "Companionship," he said honestly. "A purpose beyond myself. The chance to do right by someone who deserves better than what life has handed her so far." Scarlett studied him, searching his face for any sign of deception. "And if I'm never able to feel for you what a wife should feel for her husband, then we'll be friends who share a home and raise a child together," Yates replied. "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give, Scarlett." She took a step toward him. "And if in time I might feel more," Yates's throat tightened, "then I'd consider myself fortunate beyond measure." Scarlett nodded slowly, her decision made. "Then yes, Yates Tucker. I will marry you, both for protection and for the possibility of what might grow between us." Relief and unexpected joy washed through Yates. He reached for her hand, bringing it gently to his lips in a gesture that felt both old-fashioned and perfectly right. "We'll make the arrangements as soon as Samuel responds." That evening, as they shared a meal that felt somehow more intimate than those before it, the sound of an approaching horse broke their companionable silence. Yates immediately reached for his rifle. "Stay inside," he instructed Scarlett. "If there's trouble, use the cellar." Outside, the fading light revealed a single rider approaching at a leisurely pace. As the figure drew closer, Yates relaxed slightly, recognizing the distinctive silhouette of his friend Samuel Hayes. "You made good time," Yates called as the man dismounted. "I only sent the letter 3 days ago." Samuel, a lean man with spectacles and prematurely gray hair, clasped Yates's hand warmly. "I was already on my way when I received it. News travels fast in these parts, my friend. Particularly news of a certain mine foreman offering an increasing reward for his missing wife." Yates's smile faded. "How much now?" $200. "And he's hired Pinkerton detectives to supplement the local search." Samuel removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You've stepped into something complicated, Yates." "Come inside," Yates said, glancing around at the darkening landscape. "It's best we discuss this in private." Inside the cabin, Scarlett had retreated to the far corner, wariness evident in her posture. Yates made the introductions quickly, explaining Samuel's presence. "Mrs. Sullivan," Samuel acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Your husband has half the territory looking for you." "He's not my husband in any way that matters," Scarlett replied, a flash of defiance in her eyes. Samuel raised his hands placatingly. "I make no judgments, madam. I'm here to help as Yates requested." Over coffee, the three discussed options. Samuel confirmed what they had feared: Sullivan was using his considerable resources to widen the search, and it was only a matter of time before someone connected Yates to Scarlett's disappearance. "The marriage certificate I can provide," Samuel said. removing papers from his bag. "I brought the necessary forms. As a notary public, I can make it official, but it won't stand against determined scrutiny if Sullivan contests it." "What do you suggest?" Yates asked. Samuel considered for a moment. "Distance. The farther from lead, the better. I have connections in Montana Territory, Helena specifically. It's growing rapidly with its own gold boom. Two newlyweds looking to start fresh wouldn't raise eyebrows." "Helena," Scarlett repeated, testing the name. "How far?" "A good distance," Samuel admitted. "Several weeks' journey in your condition, especially with winter approaching. But Sullivan's reach only extends so far. The Pinkertons are thorough but stretched thin across the frontier." Yates looked to Scarlett, leaving the decision to her. "What do you think?" She was quiet for a long moment, one hand absently touching her stomach. "I think," she said finally, "that I would rather face a difficult journey than live in fear of Roland finding us. If you're willing, Yates." "I am," he said without hesitation. "We can sell the cattle, pack what we need." "Make a new start." Samuel nodded approvingly. "The stage runs from Deadwood to Billings twice a month. From there, you can arrange transportation to Helena. I can help with the sale of the ranch discreetly through intermediaries." The plan took shape quickly. Samuel would perform a simple marriage ceremony the next morning, providing them with documentation that predated Scarlett's disappearance. He would then help arrange for the sale of Yates's property and livestock, forwarding the proceeds to them once they were established in Helena. "You should leave as soon as possible," Samuel advised as the evening grew late. "Sullivan's men have already searched this area once. They'll be back for a more thorough inspection soon." That night, with Samuel asleep in the barn and their departure imminent, Yates and Scarlett sat before the fire, the reality of their situation sinking in. "Are you certain about this?" Scarlett asked quietly. "You're giving up everything you've worked for." "Land can be bought anywhere," Yates replied. "What matters is who shares it with you." Scarlett reached across the space between them, taking his hand in hers. It was the first time she had initiated such contact, and the significance wasn't lost on either of them. "I don't know if I can ever repay what you're doing for me," she said softly. Yates squeezed her fingers gently. "I'm not looking for repayment, Scarlett. I'm looking toward a future that feels right." In the flickering firelight, with their joined hands creating a bridge between them, that future suddenly seemed not just possible but inevitable, a path neither had anticipated but both were increasingly willing to follow. Morning brought a simple but profound ceremony. Standing before Samuel in the cabin that had sheltered her since her escape, Scarlett spoke vows to Yates that were technically meant to establish a legal fiction, but felt unexpectedly sincere. When Yates repeated similar promises, his steady gaze never leaving hers, Scarlett felt something bloom in her heart, not love, perhaps not yet, but its promising seedling. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Dakota, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Samuel declared, signing the certificate with a flourish. "May I present Mr. and Mrs. Yates Tucker." There was no celebratory kiss, no elaborate festivities. Instead, they immediately turned to practical matters, loading the wagon with essential supplies, securing the most valuable of Yates's possessions, and planning their route to Deadwood, where they would catch the stage heading west. By mid-afternoon, they were ready to depart. Yates took a final walk through the cabin and barn, saying a silent farewell to the dreams he had begun to build there. When he returned to the loaded wagon where Scarlett waited, her face partially obscured by a bonnet to hide her fading bruises, he found no regret in his heart, only anticipation. "Ready, Mrs. Tucker?" he asked, using her new name for the first time outside the ceremony. Scarlett's smile was small but genuine. "Ready, Mr. Tucker." with Samuel promising to follow in a few days once the sale of the property was arranged. They set off toward Deadwood, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main roads where Sullivan's men might be watching. The journey was slow and cautious, with Yates constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. They camped the first night in a sheltered gully several miles from the ranch, the wagon positioned to provide maximum protection from both the elements and any prying eyes. As Yates built a small, nearly smokeless fire and prepared a simple meal, Scarlett arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the wagon. "I know this isn't the marriage you envisioned for yourself," Yates said as they ate, "or the life you planned." Scarlett looked up from her bowl, her expression thoughtful. "I stopped envisioning any particular future the moment I married Roland. I learned quickly that dreams were luxuries I couldn't afford." She paused, gazing into the small fire. "This may not be what I planned, but it's far better than what I was living. Still, I want you to know that I meant what I said this morning," Yates continued. "I will honor and protect you as best I can." "I believe you," Scarlett said simply. After a moment, she added, "I've been thinking about Helena, what we might do there." "What skills do you have besides sewing?" Yates asked. "I can keep accounts. My father taught me the business side of his tailor shop. I can read and write well enough, and I've always had a knack for design." A hint of enthusiasm crept into her voice. "I used to sketch clothing for my father's customers, adaptations of the latest fashions from back east." "So perhaps a dress shop after all," Yates suggested, remembering her earlier mentioned dream. Scarlett nodded, warming to the idea. Helena would have wealthy mining families, merchants' wives, women who want to look fashionable despite being far from the centers of style. "And I can find work with livestock," Yates added. "Or perhaps look for land outside the city once we have our bearings." They continued talking long after the meal was finished, planning their new life with growing excitement. By the time they retired to their separate bedrolls, a fragile hope had taken root between them, a shared vision of what might be possible in Montana territory, far from Sullivan's reach. The next 2 days passed without incident as they made their way toward Deadwood. On the third morning, as they packed up their camp, the distant sound of multiple horses approaching set both on high alert. "Get in the wagon," Yates instructed, helping Scarlett climb aboard. "Stay down and out of sight." He had just enough time to grab his rifle and position himself at the front of the wagon before 5 riders crested the nearby hill. With a sinking feeling, Yates recognized the lead rider as Deputy Marshal Collins, one of the men who had accompanied Sullivan to his ranch. "Morning, Tucker," Collins called as the group approached. "Bit far from your property, aren't you?" Yates kept his expression neutral. "Heading to Deadwood for supplies." "What brings you out this way, Marshal?" Collins dismounted, his eyes scanning the campsite. "Still looking for Sullivan's wife. Search has widened considerably since we last spoke." He glanced at the loaded wagon. "That's a lot of supplies for a simple trip to town." "Planning to stock up for winter," Yates replied smoothly. "Easier to make one big trip now than multiple journeys once the snow flies." Collins nodded, though his eyes remained suspicious. "Mind if we have a look in your wagon?" "Just being thorough." Yates's mind raced. If they found Scarlett hidden inside, everything would unravel instantly. "Actually, Marshal, I do mind. I've already been searched once with no cause. Unless you have a warrant, I'll be on my way." Collins's hand moved to rest on his holstered pistol. "Getting defensive makes me curious, Tucker. What are you hiding?" The tension was broken by Scarlett herself, who emerged from the front of the wagon wearing a plain dress and bonnet, her face carefully arranged in a pleasant expression. "Is there a problem, husband?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight accent Yates had never heard from her before. Collins looked startled. "Who's this?" Before Yates could respond, Scarlett continued in the same accented voice. "Sarah Tucker, sir. Recently married to this good man." She produced the marriage certificate from her pocket, handing it to Collins. "We're heading to Montana Territory to join my brother's ranch. Is something the matter?" Collins examined the document carefully. "When did this happen? Last I heard, Tucker here was a confirmed bachelor." "We were married a week ago," Scarlett replied confidently. "A quiet affair, just us and the officiant. My Yates isn't one for grand celebrations." Collins looked from the certificate to Scarlett's face, clearly searching for any resemblance to the photograph of Scarlett Sullivan. But between the accent, the different hairstyle, and the natural changes pregnancy had brought to her face, the connection wasn't immediately obvious. "You from back east, Mrs. Tucker?" Collins asked, still suspicious. "Pennsylvania originally," Scarlett answered without hesitation. "My family immigrated from Germany when I was a child." One of the other riders spoke up. "Let it be, Collins. They've got their papers in order and we're wasting daylight. Sullivan's wife wouldn't be traveling openly like this anyway." Collins reluctantly handed the certificate back to Scarlett. "My apologies for the interruption, Mrs. Tucker. Safe travels to Montana." As the riders departed, Yates and Scarlett maintained their composed facade, though Yates could feel his heart hammering in his chest. Only when the men were well out of sight did he turn to Scarlett with undisguised admiration. "Where did that come from?" he asked, referring to her performance. Scarlett's shoulders sagged with relief. "My father's shop was in a German neighborhood in Richmond." I picked up enough of the accent to mimic it. She managed a shaky smile. "I didn't think, I just knew I had to do something." Yates impulsively took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "You were brilliant, but they'll realize the deception eventually. We need to reach Deadwood as quickly as possible." They traveled with renewed urgency, pushing themselves and the horses as much as was safe given Scarlett's condition. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of Deadwood, a raucous boomtown that seemed to vibrate with energy even at this late hour. "We'll find a room for the night," Yates decided, guiding the wagon toward a modest-looking hotel on the edge of town. "The stage leaves for Billings tomorrow afternoon. With luck, we'll be aboard it before Collins reports back to Sullivan." The hotel was clean but sparse, offering small rooms with thin walls through which the sounds of Deadwood's notorious nightlife filtered clearly. The proprietor, a stout widow named Mrs. Henderson, eyed them with practiced assessment. "Just passing through?" she asked as she recorded their names in her ledger. "Yes," Yates confirmed, placing coins on the counter. "Catching the stage to Billings tomorrow." Mrs. Henderson nodded knowingly. "Lot of folks heading west these days, running to something or away from something." "A bit of both, perhaps," Scarlett replied with a smile that revealed nothing. Their room contained a single bed, a washstand, and little else. The awkwardness of the arrangement hung between them as they brought in their essential belongings. "I'll sleep on the floor," Yates offered immediately. Scarlett shook her head. "There's no need. We're husband and wife, at least on paper, and the bed is large enough for both of us if we're careful." Yates hesitated. "Are you certain?" "Yes," she said simply. "I trust you, Yates." Those 4 words affected him more deeply than he could have anticipated. In the short time they'd known each other, trust had been established through actions rather than declarations. To hear it stated so plainly, after everything Scarlett had endured, felt like a precious gift. They prepared for bed with careful consideration of each other's privacy, turning away as garments were removed and night clothes donned. When they finally lay side by side in the darkness, a respectful space between them, Yates found himself acutely aware of Scarlett's presence, the sound of her breathing, the faint scent of soap, the slight shift of the mattress when she moved. "Yates," she whispered after several minutes of silence. "Yes, thank you, not just for today, but for everything since that night in the barn." He turned his head toward her, barely able to make out her profile in the dim light filtering through the thin curtains. "You don't need to thank me." "I do," she insisted softly. "You could have turned me away. Most men would have." "I'm not most men," Yates replied. Scarlett's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers curling around his. "No, you're not, and I'm grateful for that every day." They fell asleep that way. Hands joined in the space between them, a small but significant bridge across the divide of their separate experiences, leading toward a future neither had imagined just weeks before. Morning brought renewed tension as they prepared to board the stage to Billings. Yates arranged for the sale of their wagon and horses to a local livery stable, keeping only what they could carry in their trunks and bags. As the departure time approached, he grew increasingly vigilant, scanning every face in the busy street for signs of Sullivan or his men. "The marshal could have reached Lead by now," Scarlett said quietly as they waited at the stage office. "If he described me to Roland." "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Yates replied, trying to project more confidence than he felt. "For now, you're Sarah Tucker, and we're simply a married couple heading west like countless others." When the stagecoach finally arrived, dust-covered and running slightly behind schedule, Yates felt a surge of relief. They boarded quickly, joining 3 other passengers, an elderly minister and his wife traveling to visit their son in Billings, and a young mining engineer headed for a new job in the same city. As the driver called for departure, Yates allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps they had outpaced Sullivan's suspicions. Perhaps their new life in Helena would begin without further complications. That hope was shattered as the stage began to pull away from the station. Through the window, Yates spotted a familiar figure pushing through the crowded street. Roland Sullivan himself, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and triumph as he pointed directly at the departing coach. "He's here," Yates said urgently, gripping Scarlett's hand. "Sullivan, he's seen the stage." Scarlett's face drained of color, but her voice remained steady as she addressed the driver through the front window. "Sir, we need to depart immediately. There's a man coming who means us harm." The driver glanced back, taking in Scarlett's obvious fear and Yates's tense posture. Without asking questions, he cracked his whip and called to the horses, urging them from a walk to a trot, and then to a gallop. Sullivan's shouts were lost in the rumble of wheels and pounding of hooves as the stage lurched forward, gathering speed as it left Deadwood behind. But through the rear window, Yates could see Sullivan running toward the livery, presumably to secure a horse for pursuit. "He'll follow," Yates said grimly. The elderly minister leaned forward, concern etched on his weathered face. "Are you two in some kind of trouble?" Scarlett exchanged a look with Yates before responding. "My former husband is a violent man, sir. We're legally married," she added, touching the pocket where their certificate was kept, "but he refuses to accept it." The minister's wife reached across to pat Scarlett's hand. "We'll pray for your safe passage, child." The journey became a tense race against time, with Yates constantly watching the road behind them for signs of pursuit. The stage maintained its grueling pace, stopping only briefly at relay stations to change horses and allow passengers the most basic necessities before continuing onward. By nightfall, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Deadwood, but Yates remained vigilant. When they stopped at a remote station for the night, a simple structure offering minimal accommodations for stage passengers, he approached the station manager privately. "We may have trouble following us," Yates explained, pressing extra coins into the man's palm. "If anyone comes asking about passengers matching our description, we'd appreciate your discretion." The station manager, a grizzled veteran of the frontier with a scar running down his left cheek, pocketed the money with a knowing nod. "Wouldn't be the first folks looking for a fresh start out here. There's a back door to your room, leads straight to the stable if you need a quick exit." Grateful for the man's understanding, Yates returned to Scarlett, who was sitting rigidly by the station's small fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. "We should be safe for tonight," he assured her, keeping his voice low. "But we'll leave at first light." Scarlett nodded, her hand absently rubbing her stomach in what Yates had noticed was becoming a habitual gesture of comfort or anxiety. "I felt the baby move today," she said suddenly. "During the journey. Just a flutter, but unmistakable." The simple statement, offered in the midst of their flight, struck Yates powerfully. Amidst all the danger and uncertainty, new life continued to grow, oblivious to the circumstances of its coming into the world. "That's wonderful," he said sincerely, wishing he could reach out and place his hand where hers rested, to share in this moment that simultaneously belonged to their manufactured marriage and existed entirely apart from it. Scarlett met his gaze, something vulnerable and questioning in her eyes. "When we reach Helena, when this is behind us, would you want to be a father to this child, Yates? Truly, not just in name." The question hung between them, weighted with implications for their future. Yates considered his answer carefully, wanting to offer nothing less than complete honesty. "Yes," he said finally. "I would be honored to raise this child as my own if you'll allow it." Scarlett's smile was radiant despite her exhaustion. "I think I'd like that very much." That night, sharing another unfamiliar bed in another strange place, the space between them seemed to narrow. Though they maintained the same careful distance physically, something had shifted, a decision made, a future envisioned together rather than merely alongside one another. The stage departed at dawn, continuing its westward journey through increasingly rugged terrain. The passengers had formed a protective bond overnight, with the minister and his wife often engaging potential questioners in conversation at stops, allowing Yates and Scarlett to remain less conspicuous. 3 days into their journey, as they approached a particularly desolate stretch of road, the young mining engineer who had introduced himself as Thomas Wilson leaned toward Yates with a concerned expression. "Don't want to alarm your wife," he said quietly, "but I believe we're being followed." Single rider, keeping pace about a quarter-mile back. Been there since morning. Yates's muscles tensed. He had been watching for pursuit but had seen nothing unusual. "You're certain?" Wilson nodded. "I worked as a scout for the Army before taking up engineering." Recognizing pursuit was part of the job. "Much obliged for the warning," Yates said, then turned to Scarlett, keeping his voice calm. "We may have company behind us. Stay alert." The stage rolled on through the afternoon, maintaining its pace over increasingly difficult terrain. The pursuer remained at a distance, neither gaining nor falling back, a persistent shadow that confirmed Wilson's observation and Yates's fears. Sullivan, or one of his men, had found their trail. As dusk approached, the road narrowed as it wound through a rocky passage, steep cliffs rising on one side and a sharp drop on the other. The driver slowed the team, navigating the treacherous path with practiced caution. "Perfect place for an ambush," Wilson murmured, eyeing the terrain warily. Yates had reached the same conclusion. If our friend back there has been waiting for an opportunity, this would be it. He wasn't wrong. As the stage rounded a particularly sharp bend, a mounted figure appeared directly in their path, rifle raised. The driver pulled hard on the reins, horses whinnying in protest as the coach lurched to a stop. "That's far enough," called a voice Yates recognized immediately. Roland Sullivan sat astride a lathered horse, his expensive suit dusty from the journey but his bearing no less imposing. "I want my wife." The driver turned back to his passengers, his expression grim. "Anyone want to explain what this is about?" Before Yates could respond, Scarlett leaned forward. "That man is my former husband. He's dangerous and he has no legal right to stop this coach." Sullivan's laugh carried clearly through the evening air. "Former husband? That's a convenient fiction, my dear. Now come out of there before someone gets hurt." The minister's wife clutched her husband's arm in fear, while Wilson subtly shifted his hand toward what Yates suspected was a concealed weapon. "Stay here," Yates told Scarlett firmly. "I'll handle this." Yates. No, but he was already moving, opening the coach door and stepping down onto the rocky path, his own hand resting near his holstered revolver. "Sullivan," he acknowledged, keeping his voice steady. "You're interfering with a male coach. That's a federal offense." Sullivan's smile was cold. "Kidnapping my wife is a hanging offense, Tucker. I'm willing to take my chances with the law, are you?" "She's not your wife anymore," Yates replied, producing the marriage certificate from his coat pocket. "She's mine, legally wed and documented." "Whatever claim you think you have ended when she left you." Sullivan's face darkened with rage. "A convenient forgery, nothing more. Scarlett belongs to me, along with the child she carries." "My child?" "A child you tried to destroy," Yates shot back, anger rising despite his efforts to remain calm. "A woman you beat and terrorized. What kind of man does that make you, Sullivan?" For a moment, Sullivan seemed taken aback that Yates knew these details. Then his expression hardened again. "What happens between a man and his wife is private business. Now stand aside or I'll be forced to remove you." "I'm not going anywhere," Yates said firmly. "And neither is Scarlett." Sullivan raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Yates's chest. "Last chance, Cowboy, step aside." The tension was broken by the sound of the coach door opening again. Scarlett emerged despite Yates's attempt to block her. "Roland, enough," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You don't want me, you never did. You wanted a presentable wife to further your ambitions, a trophy to display and lead society." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "You ungrateful, I'm carrying your child," Scarlett continued, cutting him off. "A child you tried to beat out of me when you learned I was pregnant. What kind of man does that, Roland? What kind of father?" The accusation hung in the air, damning in its specificity. Even at this distance, Yates could see uncertainty flicker across Sullivan's face. "You're confused," Sullivan said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "The fall you took." "There was no fall," Scarlett interrupted, her voice rising. "You struck me repeatedly. You said a child would ruin everything, that we couldn't move to San Francisco with a squalling infant. You said you'd make sure I lost it one way or another." The minister and his wife had emerged from the coach as well, their expressions horrified. Wilson stood nearby, his hand now openly resting on a revolver at his hip. "Is this true?" the minister asked, addressing Sullivan directly. Sullivan's composure slipped further. "She's lying. She's always been unstable, prone to hysterics and delusions." "Then why did I find her hiding in my barn, bruised and terrified?" Yates challenged. "Why did she run at all if you're the devoted husband you claim to be?" Sullivan's rifle wavered slightly. "This isn't your concern, old man," he snapped at the minister, who had stepped forward. "This is between me and my wife." "Ex-wife," Scarlett corrected firmly. "I have the documentation to prove it. A legal divorce granted on grounds of cruelty, filed the day after I left lead." This was news to Yates, but he kept his expression neutral. understanding immediately that Samuel must have arranged this as well. Using his connections and knowledge of territorial law, Sullivan's face contorted with rage. "You lying whore," his words were cut short as Wilson's revolver appeared, aimed steadily at Sullivan's chest. "That's enough," the engineer said calmly. "I don't know all the details of this situation, but I've heard enough to know this lady doesn't wish to go with you, sir. I suggest you lower your weapon and be on your way." Sullivan's eyes darted between the faces confronting him, Yates's resolute determination, Scarlett's newfound courage, Wilson's steady aim, and the minister's moral condemnation. For a moment, Yates thought he might still fire, choosing violence over retreat. Instead, Sullivan slowly lowered his rifle, his expression shifting from rage to cold calculation. "This isn't over," he said, the words directed at both Yates and Scarlett. "A man doesn't let what's his be taken without consequence." "I was never yours," Scarlett replied, her voice steady, "not in any way that mattered." Sullivan spat on the ground, then wheeled his horse around. "We'll see what the territorial courts have to say about that." With a final venomous glance, he dug his heels into his mount's flanks and galloped back the way he had come. Only when Sullivan had disappeared around the bend did Yates allow himself to breathe normally again. He turned to Scarlett, who stood remarkably composed despite the confrontation. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "Yes, better than I expected to be, actually." The minister approached them, his wife at his side. "That was a brave stand, young woman, both of you." Wilson holstered his revolver, looking somewhat embarrassed by his intervention. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said with a shrug. "My mother always said no one should be forced to stay where they're not treated with respect." "Thank you," Scarlett said sincerely. "All of you." As they reboarded the coach to continue their journey, Yates noticed a subtle change in Scarlett's demeanor. Confronting Sullivan seemed to have freed something within her, a burden lifted, a fear faced and overcome. "You never mentioned the divorce papers," he said quietly once they were underway again. "Samuel arranged it," Scarlett explained. "He said it would provide an additional legal protection. I didn't know if it would hold up, given Roland's influence, but it seemed worth trying." Yates nodded thoughtfully. "Sullivan won't give up easily. He strikes me as a man unaccustomed to losing." "I know," Scarlett agreed, "but for the first time since I left him, I truly believe we might outrun his reach." She hesitated, then added, "And if not, I'll face him again if necessary." "I won't go back, Yates. Not ever." The fierce determination in her voice stirred something in Yates's heart, admiration, certainly, but also a deepening affection for this woman who had found such courage within herself. As the stage continued its westward journey through the gathering darkness, he allowed himself to imagine the life they might build together in Helena, not just as a refuge from the past, but as a genuine partnership founded on mutual respect and growing tenderness. "We'll face whatever comes together," he promised, taking her hand openly for the first time in front of their fellow passengers. "That's what marriage means, the real kind, not just the paper we signed." Scarlett's fingers tightened around his, her smile small but sincere. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said softly. "And I find I like the idea very much." The remainder of their journey to Billings passed without further incident, though Yates remained watchful for any sign of Sullivan's return. By the time they reached the growing settlement 2 days later, the shared experience had cemented a bond between all the passengers. The minister and his wife insisted on hosting them for a meal before they continued on to Helena, while Wilson offered introductions to associates in Montana Territory who might provide employment opportunities. "Good people find each other on the frontier," the minister's wife observed as they shared a simple but hearty dinner at her son's home. The West strips away pretense and reveals true character. It also offers second chances, her husband added, smiling kindly at Scarlett. A fresh beginning for those brave enough to seize it. The following morning, with directions and letters of introduction from their new friends, Yates and Scarlett boarded the stage for the final leg of their journey to Helena. As they left Billings behind, Scarlett leaned against Yates's shoulder, exhaustion finally overcoming her vigilance. "Sleep," he encouraged, placing his arm carefully around her. "I'll keep watch," she nodded drowsily. "Wake me when we see the mountains." Yates smiled, watching as she drifted into sleep against him, her expression peaceful for perhaps the first time since he'd found her in his barn. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sullivan's potential pursuit, establishing themselves in an unfamiliar city, preparing for the child's arrival, they would face them together. No longer strangers united by circumstance, but partners by choice. The Montana Territory spread before them, vast and promising, as the stage rolled westward toward Helena and the future they had chosen to share. Helena welcomed them with the bustling energy of a frontier boomtown in transition. Founded just 15 years earlier during a gold rush, the city was evolving from a mining camp into a proper settlement, with substantial brick buildings rising alongside hastily constructed wooden structures. The streets teemed with a diverse population: miners and merchants, Chinese laborers and European immigrants, all seeking opportunity in this remote corner of the territory. With the funds from the sale of Yates's ranch, forwarded by Samuel as promised, they secured modest accommodations and began the process of establishing new lives. Using the introductions Wilson had provided, Yates found work supervising livestock shipments for a growing transportation company, a position that utilized his experience with cattle while offering more stability than his previous nomadic life. Scarlett, now entering her 5th month of pregnancy, used her sewing skills to secure commissions from several prominent Helena families. Her talent for adapting Eastern fashions to frontier practicality quickly earned her a reputation among the city's more prosperous women, and within weeks, she had more work than she could comfortably manage. They settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural for two people who had known each other for such a short time under such unusual circumstances. Mornings began with shared coffee and conversation, evenings with accounts of their respective days. The small house they rented on the eastern edge of the city gradually transformed into a home, with Scarlett adding simple touches: curtains she had sewn, wildflowers in jars on the table, a handmade quilt across the bed. They now shared without the awkward distance of their early days together. Physical intimacy developed slowly between them, beginning with small gestures: a hand on the small of her back as they walked, fingers brushing as they passed items at dinner, sitting closer on the porch as they watched the sunset over the distant mountains. Their first true kiss came unexpectedly, on an ordinary evening as they prepared supper together. Yates had reached past Scarlett for a plate, their bodies close in the small kitchen, and something in the moment, the domesticity, perhaps, or the simple comfort of each other's presence, had caused them both to pause. "Yates," Scarlett had said softly, her eyes meeting his with a question she didn't need to voice. He had hesitated only briefly before lowering his lips to hers, the kiss gentle and questioning at first, then deepening as her arms wound around his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Scarlett's smile held a mixture of surprise and delight. "I've been wondering when we might try that," she admitted, her cheeks flushed. Yates tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, marveling at the turn his life had taken. "Worth the wait," he replied simply. That night, they slept in each other's arms for the first time, a new level of trust established between them, though they continued to move slowly in their physical relationship, mindful of Scarlett's advancing pregnancy and the emotional wound still healing from her first marriage. The barrier that had existed between them, the sense that their union was one of convenience rather than choice, had been definitively broken. As autumn painted the surrounding mountains with golden aspens and crimson maples, they began preparing in earnest for the baby's arrival, due shortly after the new year. Yates built a cradle from pine boards, while Scarlett sewed tiny garments during the evenings, her expression soft as she worked. "Do you have a preference?" Yates asked one night as he watched her stitch a small gown. "Boy or girl?" Scarlett considered the question, her hands resting on her now prominent belly. "I only wish for a healthy child," she said after a moment. "One who will know only kindness and love, not fear." "That I can promise," Yates said with conviction. He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking about names, though I know it's presumptuous of me." Scarlett looked up, surprised. "It's not presumptuous at all. This child will be as much yours as mine in all the ways that matter." She set aside her sewing. "What names have you considered? For a boy, perhaps Daniel, after my grandfather. For a girl—" He paused, suddenly self-conscious. "For a girl, Eleanor, after my mother. But these are just suggestions. You should choose what speaks to your heart." "Daniel Tucker or Eleanor Tucker," Scarlett said, testing the names. "Both have a fine sound." Her smile softened. "I like honoring your family. This child may not share your blood, but they will carry your name and, I hope, your character." Yates moved to sit beside her on the sofa, placing his hand gently on her stomach. "Thank you for that." As if in response, there was a distinct movement beneath his palm, a strong kick that made them both laugh in surprise. "I think someone's expressing an opinion," Scarlett said, covering his hand with hers. "Already strong-willed," Yates observed. Like their mother, Scarlett's expression grew thoughtful. "Do you know when I first began to feel safe? Truly safe, not just temporarily sheltered?" When Yates shook his head, she continued, "It was watching you with the animals on your ranch. The gentleness in your hands, the patience in your voice even with the most stubborn calf or skittish horse. I thought then that a man who could be so kind to creatures dependent on him might be kind to a woman in similar straits." "I'm glad you took that chance," Yates said softly. "When I found you in my barn that night, I couldn't have imagined where it would lead us." "To Helena, apparently," Scarlett replied with a teasing smile, then grew serious again. "To a life I never dared hope for after marrying Roland." The mention of Sullivan's name, rare in their daily conversations, brought a familiar tension. Though they had received no indication that he had followed them to Montana territory, the possibility remained a shadow at the edges of their newfound happiness. "Samuel's last letter mentioned no further inquiries at the ranch," Yates said, addressing the unspoken concern. "And there's been no word of strangers asking questions here in Helena." Scarlett nodded, though her hand tightened slightly on his. "Perhaps he's finally accepted the situation." Yates wasn't convinced, but he didn't voice his doubts. Roland Sullivan had struck him as a man who viewed people as possessions, and such men rarely relinquished their perceived property without a fight. But for now, they were safe, establishing roots in their new community, and preparing for the future they had chosen together. Winter descended on Helena with impressive force, snow blanketing the city and surrounding mountains in pristine white. Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive atmosphere despite the frontier conditions. Shopkeepers decorated their windows with greenery and ribbon. Churches organized pageants and charitable collections, and even the saloons displayed a modicum of seasonal cheer. Yates, raised with minimal observance of holidays during his nomadic childhood, found himself unexpectedly moved by Scarlett's enthusiasm for the season. She decorated their small home with pine boughs and handcrafted ornaments, baked traditional treats from her childhood, and insisted on shopping for modest gifts, despite their careful budgeting for the baby's arrival. "Christmas was always special in my father's house," she explained as they walked arm in arm through the snow-covered streets, examining the displays in shop windows. No matter how tight money was, he made sure there was something special to mark the day: good food, a small gift, music, and stories by the fire. Yates, watching her face animated with happy memories, felt a surge of gratitude that she could recall her past with joy despite the more recent trauma. "Then we'll make it special," he promised, "this year and every year to come." Their celebration was simple but heartfelt. On Christmas Eve, they attended services at the local church, where Scarlett's growing condition drew warm congratulations from neighbors and acquaintances. Christmas Day brought a shared meal with the elderly couple who lived next door, fellow newcomers to Helena, who had taken a grandparental interest in the young pair and their expected child. As they sat before their fire that night, exchanging the gifts they had carefully selected for one another, a fine leather-bound journal for Scarlett, who had begun writing again after years of suppressing the habit under Sullivan's critical eye, and a skillfully crafted silver watch fob for Yates, there was a sense of completion between them that transcended their unusual beginning. "I have something else for you," Scarlett said softly, reaching for a small package hidden beneath the sofa cushions. "It's not much, but—" Yates unwrapped the paper to find a hand-stitched handkerchief, his initials embroidered in one corner with intricate detail. But it was what lay beneath the handkerchief that caught his breath: a delicate drawing of their cabin back in South Dakota, rendered with remarkable accuracy from Scarlett's memory. "You remembered it so precisely," he said, tracing the lines of the building where they had first begun to know each other. "It was the first place I felt safe in a very long time," Scarlett replied. "I wanted to preserve it for both of us, a reminder of our beginning." Yates carefully set the drawing aside before taking her hands in his. "Scarlett, I need to ask you something, and I want your honest answer." He took a deep breath, suddenly nervous despite the intimacy they now shared. "Our marriage began as a necessary arrangement, a protection for you and your child. But my feelings have changed, grown into something I never expected. I love you, truly and deeply. What I need to know is whether you might someday feel the same, or if your heart is still too wounded from what came before." Scarlett's eyes widened at his declaration, then filled with tears that spilled onto her cheeks. For a terrible moment, Yates feared he had spoken too soon, pushed for emotions she wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Oh, Yates," she whispered, squeezing his hands tightly. "My heart isn't wounded when I'm with you. It's healing, growing stronger each day." She moved one of his hands to rest over her heart. "I already love you. I think I began falling the moment you found me in your barn and whispered that I was safe. Not because you rescued me, but because you saw me, truly saw me when I was at my most vulnerable, and you offered kindness without expectation." Joy flooded through Yates, so intense it was almost painful. He pulled Scarlett gently into his arms, mindful of her belly between them, and kissed her with all the emotion he had been carefully moderating for months. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "Merry Christmas, husband," she murmured, the word carrying a depth of meaning it had lacked when first spoken during their hasty ceremony. "Merry Christmas, wife," he replied, holding her close as the fire burned low and snow fell softly beyond their window, blanketing Helena in peaceful white. The new year arrived with biting cold and howling winds that kept most of Helena's residents indoors. For Scarlett, now in her final weeks of pregnancy, the enforced rest was welcome. Her body had grown increasingly unwieldy, sleep elusive as the baby seemed determined to practice acrobatics whenever she attempted to rest. Yates hovered attentively, ensuring she had everything she needed and frequently consulting the midwife who had agreed to attend the birth. His concern was touching, if occasionally amusing in its intensity. "I've delivered countless calves and foals," he commented one evening as they reviewed the midwife's instructions for the 100th time. "But the thought of you going through this terrifies me like nothing else." Scarlett smiled, touched by his honesty. "Mrs. Holloway says I'm healthy and the baby is positioned properly. We'll be fine, Yates." He nodded, though the worry remained etched in his face. "I just can't bear the thought of anything happening to either of you." "Nothing will," she assured him, believing it with a conviction that surprised her. After months of fear during her marriage to Roland and the desperate uncertainty of her escape, Scarlett had rediscovered a capacity for optimism she had thought permanently extinguished. Labor began in the early hours of January 9th, 1879, startling Scarlett awake with a cramping pain that left no doubt about its meaning. She lay still for a moment, cataloging the sensation and timing its duration, before gently waking Yates. "It's time," she said simply, watching as consciousness and comprehension dawned simultaneously in his eyes. What followed was a blur of activity, Yates rushing to notify the midwife and their elderly neighbors, who had promised to assist, preparing the bedroom according to Mrs. Holloway's instructions, boiling water and gathering clean linens. By the time the midwife arrived, bundled against the pre-dawn cold, Scarlett's pains were coming regularly, though still far enough apart to suggest many hours lay ahead. "First babies take their time, Mrs. Holloway declared cheerfully after examining Scarlett. "Best settle in for a long day, Mr. Tucker. You can wait in the kitchen. We'll call if we need you." Yates looked reluctant to leave, his eyes fixed on Scarlett with concern. "I'd prefer to stay if Scarlett doesn't object." The midwife raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Most men can't stomach the process, but it's her decision." "Stay," Scarlett said immediately, reaching for his hand. "Please." And so he did, remaining steadfastly by her side as the labor progressed through the morning and into the afternoon. He wiped her brow, supported her back during the worst contractions, and murmured encouragement when her strength began to flag. Mrs. Holloway, initially skeptical of his presence, gradually accepted his assistance with grudging respect. "You've got a rare one here," she told Scarlett during a brief respite between pains. "Most men I know would be at the saloon by now, drinking until it's over." As dusk approached and the labor intensified, Scarlett found herself drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The pain was extraordinary, beyond anything she had imagined, yet there was purpose to it, a fundamental female power that connected her to generations of women who had endured this same transformative experience. "You're nearly there," Mrs. Holloway encouraged as Scarlett entered the final stage. "The baby's head is visible. A few more good pushes should do it." Yates, positioned behind Scarlett on the bed to support her, pressed a kiss to her damp temple. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he whispered. "Just a little more." With a final, tremendous effort, Scarlett bore down, and the resistance suddenly gave way. There was a moment of indescribable relief, followed by the most miraculous sound she had ever heard, a strong, indignant cry announcing the baby's arrival into the world. "A boy," Mrs. Holloway declared triumphantly, deftly clearing the infant's airway and wrapping him in a prepared blanket. "And a fine one at that." She placed the squalling bundle on Scarlett's chest, where he immediately seemed to recognize her heartbeat, his cries subsiding to hiccuping breaths as his unfocused eyes opened for the first time. "Daniel," Scarlett whispered, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she gazed at her son's perfect face. "Daniel Tucker." Yates reached around her to gently touch the baby's cheek, his expression a mixture of awe and tenderness that brought fresh tears to Scarlett's eyes. "Hello, Daniel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world, son." In that moment, as the three of them huddled together in the warm, lamp-lit bedroom while winter winds howled outside, Scarlett knew with absolute certainty that the difficult journey that had brought her to this place had been worth every painful step. The boy in her arms, born of violence but welcomed with pure love, would never know the fear and shame that had characterized her marriage to Roland. He would grow up with Yates's integrity, kindness, and strength of character as his model of manhood. The weeks that followed Daniel's birth passed in the hazy, exhausting rhythm familiar to new parents everywhere. Nights were broken into small increments between feedings, days structured around the baby's needs. Yates proved as attentive a father as he had been a birth partner, eagerly participating in every aspect of Daniel's care, despite the raised eyebrows of some of their more traditional neighbors. "Never seen a man so taken with changing diapers," Mrs. Patterson from next door commented with bemused approval. "Most fathers I know don't get properly involved until the child can talk and walk." "Yates isn't most fathers," Scarlett replied simply, watching as her husband gently bathed their son, his large hands incredibly gentle as they supported the infant's head. As winter gradually gave way to spring, their small family settled into a comfortable routine. Scarlett resumed her sewing work on a limited basis, sometimes with Daniel sleeping contentedly in a basket beside her as she worked. Yates's position with the transportation company had expanded to include oversight of breeding stock, a responsibility that came with increased pay and status within the growing business. Their life in Helena felt increasingly permanent, their connection to their previous existence and lead fading with each passing day. Scarlett rarely thought of Roland now, and when she did, it was with a detached pity rather than fear. The bruises he had inflicted had long since healed, and the emotional wounds were closing as well, soothed by Yates's consistent kindness and the joy she found in motherhood. Then, just as they were beginning to believe they had truly escaped the shadow of the past, a letter arrived that shattered their hard-won peace. It came via the regular mail delivery, addressed to Mrs. Yates Tucker in a flowing hand Scarlett didn't recognize. The return address showed only R.S. Lead, Dakota Territory. Scarlett's hands trembled as she broke the seal, Yates watching with concern from across the breakfast table. "It's from Roland," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or rather, his lawyer." The letter was formal, coldly professional in its language, but its message was unmistakable. Roland Sullivan was challenging the validity of their divorce and subsequent marriage, claiming Scarlett had abandoned her legal husband without cause and taken his rightful heir. He was preparing to file suit in the territorial courts and expected her to return to lead with the child immediately to avoid public scandal and legal consequences. "He can't do this," Yates said when she finished reading, his face flushed with anger. The divorce was legal, properly filed and recorded. Samuel ensured everything was in order. "But Roland has influence with the judges in Dakota Territory," Scarlett reminded him, fear creeping back into her heart. "And money for the best lawyers." Yates reached across the table to take her hand. "We have truth on our side, Scarlett, and distance." Montana territory has its own courts, its own laws. Sullivan would have to pursue his case here, far from his sphere of influence. Unless he convinces a Dakota judge to issue a warrant, Scarlett countered, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. If he claims I kidnapped his child, then we'll fight it, Yates said firmly. We'll hire our own lawyer. We'll tell the truth about why you left the violence, the attempt to harm Daniel before he was even born. Scarlett nodded, trying to draw strength from his determination, but the old fear had returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She glanced toward the cradle where Daniel slept peacefully, unaware of the threat suddenly looming over his future. I won't let him take our son, she whispered, as much to herself as to Yates. I won't let Daniel grow up with that man's cruelty. Yates came around the table, kneeling beside her chair to look directly into her eyes. Listen to me, Scarlett. We're not the same people who fled Lead last year. You're stronger now and we're together. We have friends here, a community that knows us as a family. Sullivan may have money and connections, but he doesn't have what we have, the truth and people who will stand by us. His words bolstered her courage, reminding her of how far she had come from the terrified woman hiding in a barn. She straightened her shoulders, making a conscious decision to face this threat with the same determination that had carried her through labor and childbirth. You're right, she agreed. We'll fight him together. They consulted a local attorney that same day, a sharp-minded woman named Margaret Campbell, who had established a successful practice in Helena, despite the prejudices against female lawyers. After reviewing their documentation and listening to their story, she offered a clear-eyed assessment of their situation. The divorce appears properly executed, she confirmed, examining the papers Samuel had arranged. And your marriage is certainly legal under Montana territory law. Mr. Sullivan's claim that you abandoned him without cause is easily refuted by evidence of his abuse, which we can document through witness statements, the people who saw your condition when you reached Deadwood, perhaps. There's also the stagecoach confrontation, Yates added. The minister and his wife would testify to Sullivan's behavior, I'm certain. Miss Campbell nodded approvingly. Excellent. Character witnesses are crucial in cases like these. She tapped the lawyer's letter thoughtfully. What concerns me is the timing. Why now? Nearly 6 months after your departure. And how did Sullivan discover your location? It was a question that had been haunting Scarlett as well. They had been careful to leave few traces, changing stages multiple times on their journey west, using different names when necessary. Yet somehow Roland had found them. Someone must have recognized us, Yates speculated. Helena's growing, but it's still a small enough community that newcomers are noticed. Or he hired investigators, Miss Campbell suggested. The Pinkertons are thorough, and Sullivan has the resources to employ them. Whatever the explanation, the reality was unavoidable. Their carefully constructed sanctuary had been breached. The question now was how to defend it. I'll prepare a response to Mr. Sullivan's lawyer, Miss Campbell promised as they prepared to leave. Strong but measured. We don't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but we need to make it clear that you're prepared to defend your family through legal channels if he persists. As they walked home, Daniel sleeping peacefully in Scarlett's arms, Yates remained unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. What is it? Scarlett asked finally. You're pondering something. He hesitated, then said, I'm thinking we might need to consider a more permanent solution than legal arguments. Even if we win this challenge, Sullivan could try again, or take matters into his own hands. What kind of solution? Scarlett asked, though she suspected she knew what he was suggesting. Moving further west, Yates said. California, perhaps, or Oregon, somewhere beyond Sullivan's reach, where we could truly start fresh. The idea was simultaneously terrifying and appealing. Another journey into the unknown, another community to establish themselves in, but also the possibility of finally escaping Roland's shadow completely. "Let's see how things develop with the legal response first," Scarlett suggested. "Helena is becoming home. I'd hate to leave unless absolutely necessary." Yates nodded, though something in his expression suggested he believed such a departure might indeed prove necessary. "Whatever happens, we face it together," he reminded her, his hand resting protectively on Daniel's sleeping back. "All three of us." The following weeks brought an escalation of tensions as letters flew back and forth between Helena and Lade. Sullivan's lawyer became increasingly aggressive in his demands, while Miss Campbell maintained a firm but professional stance on their behalf. The legal battle remained theoretical, confined to paper threats and counterclaims, but the emotional toll was very real. Scarlett found herself jumping at unexpected sounds, scrutinizing unfamiliar faces in town, constantly aware of Daniel's whereabouts even within their home. Yates took to carrying his revolver more consistently, and their elderly neighbors, apprised of the situation, became unofficial sentinels, watching for strangers who showed too much interest in the Tucker household. It was Mr. Patterson, formerly a sheriff in Missouri before retiring to Montana, who first noticed the well-dressed man who appeared one afternoon in early May, observing their house from across the street. "Doesn't look like he belongs in the neighborhood," the old man reported, stopping by on the pretext of delivering some of Mrs. Patterson's freshly baked bread. "City clothes, expensive boots. Been there about an hour just watching." Yates moved to the window, positioning himself to observe without being obvious. "Not Sullivan," he confirmed after a careful look, "but could be working for him. A Pinkerton, perhaps. Want me to have a word with him?" Mr. Patterson offered, patting the revolver he still wore despite his advanced age. "Could suggest he find other scenery to admire." "No need to risk confrontation," Yates decided. "But if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye out while I'm at work, I'd be grateful." The observer returned the following day, and the day after that, maintaining his distance but making no effort to conceal his presence. On the fourth day, he was joined by another man, equally well-dressed but with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to physical confrontation. "They're building to something," Yates said grimly as they ate dinner that evening, the curtains drawn against prying eyes. "Gathering information, establishing patterns." "For what purpose?" Scarlett asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Yates met her gaze directly. "To take Daniel, I suspect. Sullivan's lawyer mentioned retrieving the child in his last communication." The words sent ice through Scarlett's veins. She looked to where Daniel lay in his cradle, blissfully unaware of the threat gathering around him. At 4 months old, he had begun to show distinct personality traits, a curious intensity when examining new objects, a ready smile for those he recognized, a determined streak when pursuing something that caught his interest. He was thriving under their care, growing stronger each day. "We can't wait for them to make a move," she said decisively. "We need to act first." Yates nodded, apparently having reached the same conclusion. "I think it's time to consider that more permanent solution we discussed." The plan came together quickly, born of necessity, and the recognition that legal channels might not provide protection swiftly enough. With the assistance of Miss Campbell, who recognized the genuine danger to Daniel and set aside her preference for strictly legal remedies, they made discreet arrangements for departure. Rather than heading directly west as they had initially discussed, they decided on a less predictable route north into Canada, where Sullivan's influence and legal claims would hold even less weight. Miss Campbell had connections in Victoria, on Vancouver Island, where Yates's livestock experience would be valuable and Scarlett's sewing skills marketable. "It's a beautiful place," the lawyer assured them as they finalized details in her office, growing quickly but still maintaining some civility. The British influence ensures a certain respect for law and order that you might find reassuring after recent events. Preparations were necessarily secretive. They packed only what was essential, sold or stored the rest, and arranged for a wagon and team through intermediaries to avoid drawing attention. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson agreed to depart with them. The elderly couple had been considering joining their daughter in Washington Territory, and welcomed the opportunity to travel with protection while providing additional support for the young family. The watchers continued their surveillance, unaware that their presence was accelerating plans already in motion. On the night chosen for departure, as a spring storm provided cover with its thunder and driving rain, the two households slipped away separately, the Pattersons leaving first with most of the luggage, Yates and Scarlett following an hour later with Daniel, taking a different route out of Helena. They rendezvoused at a predetermined location several miles outside the city, where they joined the wagons into a small train and continued northward through the darkness. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Helena, the storm having obscured their tracks and delayed any potential pursuit. "You think they'll follow?" Scarlett asked as they paused to rest the horses mid-morning, Daniel nursing contentedly in her arms. Yates scanned the horizon behind them, seeing nothing but empty Montana landscape. "Sullivan is persistent, but even he has limits to his reach. Once we cross into Canada, his legal claims become significantly weaker." "And what about us?" she pressed, the question she had been avoiding finally surfacing. "Do we have limits too? How long can we keep running?" Yates's expression softened as he looked at her and Daniel, the two people who had transformed his solitary existence into something rich with meaning. "This isn't running, Scarlett. It's choosing our family over fear, choosing to build something lasting in a place where we can truly be free." He sat beside her on the wagon seat, his arms slipping around her shoulders. "Victoria will be our home, not just another temporary shelter. I promise you that." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his certainty. "Then lead on, Mr. Tucker. I'm ready for home." The journey to Victoria was long and not without challenges: spring storms, difficult river crossings, the inevitable tensions of travel with a small child and elderly companions. But there was also beauty in the ever-changing landscape, camaraderie around evening campfires, and the growing conviction that they were moving toward something meaningful rather than merely fleeing a threat. They crossed into Canada without incident, the border in these remote regions being more theoretical than strictly enforced. As they continued westward toward the coast, the mountains grew more imposing, the forests denser, the rivers wilder in their spring abundance. Daniel thrived despite the journey's difficulties, growing noticeably stronger and more alert with each passing week. By late June, they reached Victoria, a city that lived up to Miss Campbell's description: civilized yet vigorous, with imposing government buildings alongside bustling commercial streets, all set against the stunning backdrop of mountains and sea. The British colonial influence was evident in everything from architecture to social customs, creating an atmosphere distinctly different from the American frontier towns they had known. With the funds they had carefully preserved, supplemented by the proceeds from the sale of their Helena home, forwarded by Miss Campbell once they were safely established, they secured a modest but comfortable house on the city's outskirts. The property included several acres of land, enough for Yates to keep a few animals and eventually expand into small-scale ranching if he chose, while remaining close enough to Victoria's center for Scarlett to establish connections with the city's growing population of prosperous merchants and officials. The Pattersons continued on to their daughter's home in Washington Territory, but not before helping the young family settle into their new surroundings and extracting promises of regular correspondence. Their departure was emotional, the bonds formed during their shared journey having deepened the friendship that had begun in Helena. "You watch over these young people," Mrs. Patterson instructed her husband as they prepared to board the steamer that would take them south. "Make sure they're finding their way properly." "They'll do fine," Mr. Patterson replied with confidence, shaking Yates's hand firmly. "Got good heads on their shoulders, both of them." As summer bloomed across Vancouver Island, Yates and Scarlett gradually established themselves in Victoria society, not among the highest echelons, but within a respectable middle class of skilled professionals and business owners. Yates's knowledge of livestock proved valuable to the island's developing agricultural sector, while Scarlett's sewing skills quickly attracted clients among merchants' wives and government officials' families. Daniel continued to flourish, reaching milestones that delighted his parents: his first attempts at crawling, the emergence of 2 tiny teeth, his infectious laughter when Yates tossed him gently into the air. Watching him develop free from the shadow of his biological father's influence was a daily joy that neither Yates nor Scarlett took for granted. They received occasional updates from Miss Campbell, who reported that Sullivan had indeed come to Helena personally upon discovering their departure, his rage evident in his subsequent actions, threatening the lawyer, interrogating neighbors, even attempting to bribe local officials for information on their destination. "But the trail has gone cold for him," she wrote in her most recent letter, "and his influence diminishes with distance and time. I believe you are safe in your new home, though continued caution is always advisable." It was advice they heeded, maintaining a certain wariness even as they built their new life. But gradually, the vigilance that had characterized their early months in Victoria eased, replaced by the comfortable routines of a family firmly established in a community that had welcomed them without question. On a crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Daniel sleeping peacefully in Scarlett's lap, Yates found himself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked, his voice quiet so as not to disturb their son. "When I found you in the barn," Scarlett's hand stilled in its gentle stroking of Daniel's dark hair. "Sometimes," she admitted, "though less often now. It feels like another lifetime, another person, almost. You were so afraid," Yates recalled, the memory still vivid despite the months that had passed. "I remember wanting nothing more than to convince you that you were truly safe." "You did," Scarlett said simply, reaching for his hand. "Not just with words, but with everything that followed. You showed me what safety really means, not just absence of danger, but presence of love." Yates brought her fingers to his lips, the gesture that had become a cherished intimacy between them. "I never imagined, when I bought that ranch in Dakota Territory, that I was really building a path to you. To this." Scarlett smiled, the last rays of sunlight illuminating her face, no longer bruised, no longer haunted, but radiant with contentment. "Perhaps some things are meant to be, even when they begin in darkness." As twilight settled over Victoria and the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky, Yates Tucker held his wife's hand and watched his son sleep, knowing with absolute certainty that his life had found its true purpose on that stormy night when a frightened woman had sought refuge in his barn. Whatever challenges lay ahead and life would surely bring its share, they would face them together. Their bond forged in adversity, but sustained by something far stronger. A love chosen freely, with eyes wide open to both its costs and its immeasurable rewards. In the years that followed, Victoria proved to be the home they had sought, a place where their family could put down roots and flourish away from the shadows of the past. Yates established a successful breeding operation specializing in horses suited to the island's terrain and climate, while Scarlett's dressmaking business expanded to include a small shop in the commercial district, where her designs became sought after by Victoria's most fashionable women. Daniel grew into a strong, curious boy with his mother's artistic sensibility and his father's quiet integrity. Though he shared no biological connection with Yates, anyone observing them together would have no doubt of the bond between father and son, evident in shared mannerisms, mutual respect, and the easy affection that characterized their relationship. When Daniel was 3, the family welcomed a daughter, Eleanor, born on a bright spring morning, with Yates once again by Scarlett's side throughout the labor. Unlike the tension that had surrounded Daniel's birth, Eleanor arrived into a household secure in its foundations, her tiny presence completing a family that had been built choice by choice, day by day, from the most unlikely beginnings. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together before the fire in their Victoria home, Scarlett would catch Yates watching her with an expression of wonder, as if he still couldn't quite believe the life they had created together. "What are you thinking?" she would ask, though she often knew the answer before he spoke. "That I'm grateful," he would reply, drawing her closer, "for the storm that drove me back to the barn that night, for whatever courage led you to my door, for every decision that brought us here." And Scarlett, nestled against the heart of the man who had first whispered, "You're safe now," when safety seemed an impossible dream, would silently echo that gratitude for the journey that had begun in fear but led to this abiding love, for the family they had forged from adversity, and for the home they had built together, strong enough to weather any storm that might come their way.